I've known that it's an honor to be here, but it just occurred to me that it's also really a pleasure to be here because we don't have many occasions to speak to our colleagues about what we do, which is obviously the point of the lecture series, but somehow it just dawned on me. So it's a great joy to be here and to be talking to colleagues and some of our students as well on this topic. And the lecture series have taken us this particular year as far back as medieval China and as far out there as the Sargasso Sea. And today I'll be taking you to Moscow, Russia in the 1990s. And I would like to start from two images. In some ways, they speak for themselves. One is the image of opulence, wealth, ostentatious consumption that you sometimes come across when you read coverage of Russia in mainstream media. The other image is almost the polar opposite of that. It conjures up the sense of poverty, destitution, and social disintegration. In some ways, both of them have something of substance to convey. But they also leave something out, and that's the everyday life of those who fall in between of those two poles, but also who can in some ways relate to both. Those who feel very constrained in some ways by their social and economic circumstances, but also those that enjoy going to public spaces and participating in social life, shopping, socializing with friends, and so on. In some ways, this contrast is similar to another entrenched dichotomy, that between everyday life and social crisis, which are rarely considered as in tandem. Everyday life is usually thought about as a realm of routine and repetition, whereas crisis is an occasion that's out of the ordinary and that disrupts the flow of everyday life. So there is this sense, which is very visible today in the current coverage of the tragedy in Japan, that when a crisis hits, everyday life somehow stops. And this, of course, is not true, which was why when I was thinking about the cover for my book, and I didn't know Arafat would plug it, so I thought I'd plug it myself. When I was choosing the cover for my book, I came across a photograph by a Russian photographer, Igor Mukhin, which really taps into what I'm trying to convey here, that in the midst of dismantling of Soviet ideology and all the social and economic upheavals, people do continue to go about their daily business, and some of them even wearing spiffy shoes. Here, I would like to challenge this presumed dichotomy between crisis and the everyday. I will argue that extended social crises, like the ones that Russians experienced in the wake of USSR's collapse, have an everyday life of their own, and that we should attend to the logics of this everyday life if we want to understand why people responded to the aftermath of USSR's collapse the way that they did. More specifically, I will suggest that people's day-to-day routines in the 1990s were peculiar in two ways. First, they were shaped by profound uncertainty that marked political, economic, and ideological landscapes of the time. So in a sense, what you had was a simultaneous shifting of all kinds of social coordinates, professional, cultural, political, you name it, constant shifting of the ways by which one could measure one's place in life. And second, the protracted nature of the post-socialist crisis meant that it became a kind of a new normal, and that's central to the evolution of the ground rules of post-socialist life, of the ways in which people define themselves and thought about what constitutes everyday competence and practical wisdom in this changed world. These new standards for competence revolved around the idea, and I would say ideal, of autonomy and self-protection from the crisis, which in my view remains highly significant for how post-Soviet political and everyday culture continues to operate to this day. Now, in the spirit of self-disclosure, I spent most of the 1990s in Moscow, first as a student at the Moscow State University, and later during field trips from my new base at the University of Pennsylvania. In this sense, the line between my everyday observations and the fieldwork experiences that I drew on in my book is more than a little fuzzy. This being said, because sociologists love talking about samples, so I can say that the bulk of my book is based on recurrent conversations with a group of 33 Muscovites from various walks of life, from differing economic and social backgrounds. My only expectation was that they were quote-unquote lay people. In other words, that they didn't have any professional knowledge of economics or politics. And I talked with them about their lived experience of post-socialist transformation. I visited their homes and workplaces, carried out ethnographic observations in various sites in the city, from open-air markets to public transport, and explored a number of other venues to which my conversations led me. When I started these, this was before the financial meltdown of 1998. And I originally expected my meetings to provide me with insight to how rapidly people's lives have changed, because I was talking with them recurrently from 98 to 2000. I thought it would be all about change and how rapidly their lives changed. I discovered that much of my conversations actually revolved around the ways in which my contacts tried to resist change, and the often ingenious ways in which they endeavored to make their lives immune from the effects of protracted post-socialist instability. So all in all, between 1998 and 2000, I conducted over 110 interviews. And here I will try to convey the spirit of these conversations and connect them to the questions of crisis and the everyday from which I began. So as I'm sure you know, the USSR fell apart in 1991. And in 1992, you had the introduction of neoliberal reforms, which triggered quickly population's loss of savings through denomination that was recommended and perhaps economically also inevitable. This triggered very rapid inflation. So in 1992, for example, the rate of inflation was 2,600% a year. In 1993, there was another political upheaval, the shelling of the parliament. Mid-1990s were marked by the rise of conservative and nationalist opposition. Yeltsin's behavior was becoming more and more erratic. In the late 90s, the power struggle between the increasingly ill Yeltsin, Yeltsin's kind of various pretenders to succeed him as a president became especially desperate. So there were media attacks on various contenders to presidency and constant reshuffling in the government. Just within the 2 years of my fieldwork, 4 governments came and went in rapid succession. The economic situation was equally turbulent. I've already mentioned the economic default of August 1998, when just within 3 days, the exchange rate of the ruble skyrocketed from a little bit over 6 to almost 30 per dollar. Just within a very short bracket of time. And this was really a matter of everyday relevance. So people would talk on the streets about what, it was like even more kind of intensely than talking about temperature. You know, you would walk into the subway and the person checking tickets would ask, you know, have you looked at the dollar rate? What is it right now? Because it was constantly fluctuating. And many of my respondents remember these days in August when it wasn't uncommon, for example, for price tags in the store to change up to 3 times a day. So the salespeople would sit and watch TV and rewrite price tags as time goes by. So you could start from milk costing, you know, 6 rubles and end up towards the end of the day with the milk costing 30 rubles. The salaries, of course, didn't change. Instead, you had massive layoffs and payment errors. And this general atmosphere was routinely characterized as explosive. Perhaps even more unsettling than this economic instability was the fact that social and economic hardships were not accompanied ideologically by a widely shared national agenda, so that sacrifices that they entailed could not be rendered palatable or at least more or less sensible in ideological terms, as was the case, for example, in the countries of Eastern Europe, where the fall of socialism was experienced in terms of national liberation and a return to Europe. In its imperial heartland, the Soviet system had not only a much longer history, but it also couldn't be obviously externalized as imposed from the outside. And as a result, the ideological landscape of the decade had a kind of a pentimental quality to it. So the new layers coexisted with the still visible and powerful old ones, which were never discarded or dismantled. So you would have new holidays such as Russia Day that celebrated Russia's sovereignty from the USSR, existing in the calendar side by side with the anniversaries of October Socialist Revolution that brought to the creation of the USSR, and churches dedicated to the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, would be founded on the city map that also has streets that honor one of his assassins, Pyotr Voykov. And this wasn't just a theoretical, kind of remote affair, this ideological hodgepodge. To the contrary, it had a number of consequences directly relevant to everyday life. For one, it generated uncertainty about the meaning of one's own family history and biography. So was somebody's Bolshevik grandfather a hero or a villain? Wasn't clear. Was one's parent a dunce or a role model for volunteering for the Virgin Soil campaign? It also raised important questions about the appropriate standards of behavior today, or at the time, in the rapidly changing moral universe. Remembering his return from the obligatory army service, one of my respondents, Nikolai, who was at the time 31-year-old freight operator, put explicitly precisely that sense, and I'll quote. He said, "I returned from the army in 1987. It was certainly some interesting time. We were drafted in one country, and 2 years later came back to a completely different one. All these economic changes started. Somebody was leaving for business, others stayed. People were somehow trying to earn capital, and for a while it was like fishing in muddy waters. Some people were still serving sentence for speculation and currency operations, whereas others already conducted these operations in the open. They could be arrested, but they could also be left alone. In the old Soviet Union, things like that could never be allowed, but the old structure was falling apart in front of our very own eyes." While the legal order was rapidly dissipating, so was the system of professional stratification. The reality of 1990s amounted to rapid and mostly downward mobility of specific individuals as well as entire professional groups, such as medical professionals or engineers, for example, of whom there was an enormous number in the USSR. And at times, the choice seemed only between radically changing one's occupation, usually without retraining and with the demotion of status, like when an engineer would enroll to work for a construction brigade or become a salesman on the market, or sticking to one's enterprise but then sinking with it, as his engineer colleagues might have done. The humiliation this entailed gave rise to an entire subgenre of Russian anecdotes, which were dedicated to a chance meeting of two classmates, a star student who turned into an engineer, and a failing student who became a prosperous new Russian. And I'll give you just one example for the gist of this, which again depicts a chance meeting of these two characters, with the new Russian exclaiming, "Oh, great to see you, Vasya, how are you doing?" "Poorly, Max, I haven't eaten in 3 days." "Really? Well, that's not right. You have to force yourself to eat." And this anecdote lampoons, I think, very wittily, not only this dramatic distance between the former star and kind of the former pariah, I guess you could say, but also the latter's inability to even conceive of these distance, presumably because of his limited intelligence, which was something that was usually assumed about New Russians. Perhaps this admittedly very broad brushstroke of a picture makes it a bit clearer why the developments of the 1990s were so often referred to and understood under a broad heading of crisis or crisis. The notion of crisis was used across the board in academic publications as well as in everyday conversations, and even in poetry. So this is a cover from a very famous Soviet and now Russian poet, Andrei Voznesensky, where the entire collection is entitled "Жуткий кризис Superstar," which is obviously a pun on Jesus Christ Superstar, but means awful crisis superstar. This admittedly is something of a stylistic excess, but you get a sense in which crisis really becomes a kind of a taken for granted notion that one can be satirical about or lampoon. To assert that the country was in crisis was really to say something entirely uncontroversial at the time. If anything, one had to justify any other definition of the situation. And if I can abuse your patience, I'll give you another anecdote. This is the last one. The rest of the paper doesn't have anecdotes. But there is a joke about a telephone that rings in an apartment, and somebody picks up and says, "Hello? Hi, how are you?" "Very well, thank you." "Oh, sorry, I must have a wrong number." Which really communicates exactly the sort of thing that I'm trying to convey here, which is this is the default expectation. Something must be wrong with you if you don't think our country is in crisis. But there were two aspects of the term crisis as it was used in the 1990s that I would like to underscore here. The first is the permanent character of what is usually thought about as momentary but decisive moment. And etymologically, the word crisis derives from the Greek word krinein, and forgive my Greek, to decide, which designates a key moment in the development of illness. It's originally a medical term in which the patient either recovers, or after which the patient either recovers or dies. It's not a permanent state. And yet it's exactly this permanence that's hinted at in the following two excerpts that I'll give you from an interview. And these were uttered within mere 10 or 20 minutes from one another. I was talking with Luba, who worked, she was trained as a nurse, but worked as a cleaning lady, kind of exemplifying this occupational shift that I mentioned to you. And she said at some point, as I inquired about what was new, she said, nothing global happened lately. The government has changed, but that wasn't anything that I would feel as a change. Nothing has changed in our lives. It's just going as it is, little by little. And then in just a few moments or minutes, and without seemingly remembering or realizing the inconsistency, she also said, it's all changing right now. I can't even figure out how to save money. Even with dollars, well, I hope they're not going to restrict it right now, but still, there's no stability. In our life, you just cannot relax. Today you have one situation, and tomorrow it's completely different. So here there's a kind of a blend of two messages that are seemingly contradictory, because she recreates by turns images of increasingly aggravated social situation and a static, unchangeable routine. After my book was published, a friend sent me a postcard which does exactly that. And with the caption that says, everything's about the same here, how are things with you? In a certain sense, this is what she does, except she doesn't do it as a joke. For her, these themes are actually not mutually exclusive. And I would argue that it makes sense in a certain way. For two reasons. First, the post-1991 change has been so constant in people's lives that by 99, when we're having this conversation, it seemed like the only reliable thing to expect from the future. And second, it calls attention to the dramatic gap that existed between people's lives prior to the late 80s and everything that followed after. And I think in light of that gap, all of the perturbations that occurred to them since the end of the USSR really shrank by comparison. So you have that image of permanence of a crisis. The second significant aspect of the post-socialist crisis, as it was envisioned by my context, was its multifaceted character. Perhaps the most exasperating aspect of the post-socialist situation for people that I spoke to was that they could never predict what kind of problem they'll face next, whether the new challenge will have to do with their finances or income or health or employment. So the fact of impending problems was usually assumed, but the exact kind could never be foreseen. As a result, to live in post-socialist Moscow meant, according to my respondents, always being ready for everything. There is no time for strategic planning or even any planning for the future, one of my respondents told me during an interview. Blows come from this direction and from that direction, from all over the place, and you only have time for petty, everyday tactics. We're waiting for something bad to happen all the time, seconded Valentina, a 31-year-old daycare teacher. Lately, what Yeltsin has been doing and what's been happening in the country has been constantly hitting us all over the head, she said, so that one can't even relax or have a break because I feel like we're constantly waiting for something. Political scientists at the time wrote about the dilemma of simultaneity in Russia, which referred to a sense of risks that are posed by efforts to simultaneously implement changes in economic, political, and social sectors of society at the same time. But this dilemma of simultaneity receives an interesting twist here. It suggests a state of perpetual readiness for anything and everything, a kind of permanent mobilization, which implies an incessant labor of anticipating future problems, whatever direction they may come from. Well, everyday strategies of the weak are always imagined in terms of resistance, or I should say often imagined in terms of resistance. What this framing of a permanent crisis suggested was not pointed resistance against specific dangers that were known, but rather multifarious self-protection from the dangers that were both real and imagined, current and anticipated, past and future. In my interviews, a recurrent metaphor came to designate this mind state of permanent mobilization. It was the metaphor of living on a volcano, which my contacts used to describe the labor that went into their everyday lives. Now, the experience of living on a volcano, I would argue, had lasting repercussions for people's sense of self and for the public culture of today's Russia more generally. To begin with individual subjectivity, what I think was at stake was a revised hierarchy of skills and talents, a new notion of order, safety, caution, and responsibility, and a new understanding of what it meant to be a practically competent individual. While the experience of the 1990s doubtlessly uprooted and threw into questions many taken for granted assumptions that comprised the pragmatic knowledge of the Soviet civilization, the spirit also offered, via the notion of crisis, a new consensual definition of the situation, and a new shared understanding of what it meant to be competent in these changed circumstances. This was all the more significant given that other grounds for claiming competency, and indeed other identities, became highly questionable, as I've mentioned before. What did these competencies require? In a sense, the answer to this question is contained in the characterization of post-socialist crisis that I offered. Because the crisis was experienced in a routinized way as a permanent backdrop of everyday life. It called not for temporary adaptations, but more kind of stable and permanent solutions. So in response to the permanence of unfavorable social circumstances, one could juxtapose the permanence of daily life, which was to be achieved through getting accustomed to these circumstances. As one of my respondents, a 53-year-old engineer, put it, he said, "I had no panic in August 98 or any special moods that, I won't be able to feed my family or something. These times of the Great Depression or this crisis of the 1930s that they had in America, as they showed us on TV with suicides and all that, it makes me laugh. Someone got bankrupt. So what, he got bankrupt? I don't know. For Russia, in Russia, we've been living this way for the longest time." What he implies in this comparison between Russia in the 1990s and the US in the 1930s is that while a sudden economic breakdown may come as a shock to somebody who's not accustomed to them, such a breakdown would not be able to affect the community which has been exposed to an equally grave developments over a long period of time, and which has developed an entire infrastructure to deal with these shocks. And since the second important feature of the post-socialist situation was that its dangers seemed to be lurking in all areas of life, a competent defense was imagined in equally multifaceted ways, not as a targeted strategy of resisting specific mishaps, but as a utopia of complete autonomy and self-protection from post-socialist dangers. The comment that I just offered gives one example of what such autonomy would look like in the psychological sense. So a stance of somebody who is so hardened by the crisis that he does not lose his poise in the face of events that would shatter more sensitive and less competent souls. But this psychological autonomy had other manifestations as well, and I frequently encountered them in my conversations with Muscovites. For example, reluctance to follow the news so as not to be affected by negative social and political developments, a proud and quite unapologetic divestment from politics, studied displays of skepticism and distrust in public interactions and exchanges. One 34-year-old Muscovite, for example, told me with a mixture of sarcasm and pride, she said, "I have no fears, I'm an optimist. You know why? Because I'm not well informed. I have no interest in getting informed. Those who have information, they may be scared of what's to come, but I make a point of avoiding it." So far from being apologetic or embarrassed by this professed ignorance, my interlocutor portrayed her self-imposed disconnection from the current events as a form of wisdom, the only reasonable strategy for preventing the disorderly environment from exercising an emotional toll on her. An elderly Muscovite echoed the same sentiment by dismissing politics from the range of subjects worthy of attention, let alone debate. Contemplating aloud about the political tumult of the 1991, so the the communist coup that failed due to the democratic opposition. And really kind of grassroots action when people went into the streets and the tanks kind of drowned in the crowd. She said, "Nothing changed because of the change in government. And now not millions go to these demonstrations, but handfuls. And it's all because people understand that politics isn't worth anything. Everyone should take care of their own business. If you elected the politicians, let them think about people, but they don't do it. They only look after their own interests, and people now understand it and don't even go to vote. Instead, everyone started taking care of their own lives. They understood that if they don't take care of their lives, no one will." This brings us to another related aspect of autonomy. While psychological and emotional immunity from the post-socialist situation is obviously great, but obviously nobody would conceive of it without at the same time thinking about practical autonomy. This meant that the meticulous work of information avoidance and skepticism had to be supplemented with a patchwork of practical arrangements that ensured that one's livelihood was as immune to the effects of post-socialist instability as possible. And since the dangers, as I mentioned, were experienced as coming from everywhere, the defenses were to be equally universal. In practice, this meant a kind of an effort to create a protective cocoon around oneself and one's immediate household to shield the family from the effects of the all-embracing crisis, replacing to the extent it was possible, and this of course varied between different households, all compromised post-socialist institutions with some forms of alternatives. A good example of such compensatory self-protection is offered by the so-called rakushki garages. Rakushka is a word for shell in Russian. These are easily assembled car shelters that are built out of several sheets of steel, as you can see, but they don't have a floor. Instead, you have the two sides are kind of connected by two parallel bars. And the car, when it's in the rakushka, stands with its wheels on the bars, so you couldn't lift it up with a crane and take it away. These were enormously popular. I have a number of images from various Moscow yards from the late 1990s. In 1991, the city of Moscow estimated that there were about 200,000 of these predominantly unlicensed rakushki on its territories, and the rate of growth for these exceeded the rate of growth in the number of cars, which is interesting in itself. They were made for all car sizes, were relatively inexpensive in comparison with traditional garages, and because of this lack of a floor, they had an ambiguous status of movable property, so they didn't have to be licensed as real estate. You didn't have to pay tax for them. You didn't need a license from the city to install one of these because they had no floors. Now, rakushki protected their owners from multiple risks. The first and perhaps most obvious one was the risk of robbery or vandalism of the car itself, and manifested in a sense their distrust in the public order and the kind of state of morality out there. Second, investing one's savings in a rakushka ensured that they would not evaporate due to inflation. And this was highly consequential because within that decade, the inflation was such that the sum of 10,000 rubles in one year would buy you ice cream, and another year it would buy you one of those jobbers. So if you had $10,000, you better invest them now because you might not be able to do so later. Third, in case of one's financial situation rapidly deteriorating, a rakushka could be easily rented out, thus providing sustenance during hard times. And in this sense, they compensated for all sorts of inadequacies. Inadequacies of police protection, of the banking system, in addition to providing a form of insurance against unforeseen job loss or impoverishment. Almost every popular institution of post-socialist life made similar claims of enabling self-protection from the threatening outside world. This was the era of fortified doors to one's apartment entrance, of charismatic healers and natural medicine chains that claimed to compensate for the inadequacies of official medicine, of compulsive investments of savings into duplicate and often unnecessary household items so that they don't vanish in the bank, and of consumer advice magazines whose claim to fame was that they alone could help consumers protect themselves from fraud. At times, the theme of self-protection seemed like the only grounds on which any product or service could be effectively advertised, sometimes even to the point of comedy. But what I wanted to give you an example of was an editorial that I found in the very first issue of what eventually became a very popular crossword publication at the time when crossword publications really exploded in popularity. This one is called Русский кроссворд, and it's very first, so this is literally the first of a genre that eventually became enormously popular. There's an editorial in it which says the following. It says, so many factors have appeared these days that negatively affect our health. The tap water is to be avoided since it has some additives in it. Breathing is said to be safest in a gas mask, since the air is polluted beyond all limits. Foodstuffs represent the problem as well. So easy it is to bump into a forgery. But is everything really so depressing? Isn't there anything out there that could improve our well-being? Thank God there is a reliable solution. And the text goes on to claim that according to unspecified scientific research, solving one crossword puzzle adds 45 minutes to your life, reduces stress, normalizes blood pressure, and can therefore be used as an antidote to all of these negative factors mentioned above. And this medicalized self-legitimation is telling because it combines many elements of the crisis rhetoric that I mentioned, suggesting, and seemingly without irony, that crossword puzzle was the best answer to a multitude of diverse dangers inherent in the post-socialist setting. I actually was so fascinated by crossword puzzles, I did kind of a separate leg of fieldwork on it, and discovered that they run readers' letters, and they receive enormous amounts of letters. They have, the publications have specific sections or offices which deal with readers' letters. And I've looked at some of these letters, and apart from thanking the favorite publication for helping resolve some of their health problems, there are multiple ways in which people think puzzles kind of compensate for the inadequacies of post-socialist life, by compensating for failures of schools, by allowing for independent exercise of the intellect, compensating for the loss of social status, because solving the crossword puzzles enables those who had to switch from engineering to market trading still be involved intellectually. So it was really seen as this kind of compensatory godsend. And despite its oddity, the logic that's inherent in this advertising pitch, that surrounding world is inherently hostile and should be kept at arm's length to the extent possible, and that infrastructural failures are best remedied through individual compensatory solutions. This logic was far from uncommon. Here's, for example, the voice of a successful manager, Anton. He says, "Comfort, it's when a thunderstorm outside makes you feel even more cozy and comfortable at home. That's the very crux of it. I have fully resolved this issue. I have fully shielded my family from the crisis. I found sufficient resources, energy, and willpower to shield, to make sure that my family is not affected. It's a difficult issue that outside things are not as good. When my mother goes for her class reunion and sees people she hadn't seen for 40 years, she comes back almost in tears. Dear God, she used to be this and that, the secretary of the regional party committee, and how she lives now. They haven't seen meat for 4 months." Or something like this. She never experiences this in her own life, but she does bring in this cold from the outside. Yet in my home, it is warm, dry, and comfortable. Now, hidden behind Anton's pride in being able to protect his family from the crisis was really meticulous work for creating as complete a separation from post-socialist situation as possible. He maintained a savings account in a German bank. He equipped his apartment with not one, but 2 fortified doors. He even shipped in water that his family used for cooking and drinking in a water cooler from a Western company. And here the art of interior design is inseparable from the drive to purge all sides of post-socialism from one's living environment. The kind of renovations that he did are called in Russian Euro-remont, or Euro repairs. And the Euro component of the repair referred to the completeness with which the interiors of the apartment were basically redone and purged of all signs of Sovietness. to reflect Western residential conventions. They usually involved plastic windows. So here, just by looking at the outside of a building in Moscow, you can immediately say, which household is doing better in terms of kind of that project of creating physical autonomy in their apartments than others. Let me make two points as we begin to wind down this necessarily rushed tour through the 1990s Moscow. The first is that in my context lives, the post-socialist crisis was obviously a great problem, but also perhaps more surprisingly, also kind of a solution to the moral and practical dilemmas associated with the end of socialism. And by this I mean the following. In the dearth of other criteria by which one could judge how well one is doing, given that money was a dubious criterion and professional identities were uprooted, the competence with which one could navigate the crisis became a really important measure of individual ability. So in other words, one had little control over whether one's enterprise would still be in existence tomorrow, but one could certainly make sure that she was adept enough to anticipate this possibility and make practical preparations for it. In this sense, the post-socialist crisis could be the backdrop against which one could construct a competent presentation of self and, in a sense, regain a sense of agency that was so profoundly undermined by post-socialist developments. Moreover, this laboriously cultivated autonomy also made it possible to conceive of one's personal trajectory in terms of personal maturation, as is visible from the following quote. An accountant, Zhenya, said the following when I asked her about her political commitments. She said, I used to have this, the elevated drive to go onto the square, to resist and so on, a long time ago. Youth, These things pass with time, and this country teaches you all the correct lessons. So you have she construes a kind of a reverse political socialization, where really developing wisdom and kind of understanding how the world works entails shedding the former naivete. And as a result, it kind of enables her to kind of think of herself as having made some progress in some ways through the 1990s. She was incidentally one of the people that did go out into the streets in 91. My second and more pessimistic point is perhaps already apparent here. It's striking even, especially today, as we follow the rapid development of political events in the Middle East, how far from contention Muscovites were led by this effort to cope with post-socialism. Recently, a well-known writer, Vyacheslav Pietsuch, remarked in an interview that the chief life's work of any cultured person, both today and before, is a complete self-isolation from Russian reality. And you can sense tangible frustration on his behalf with the structure of political opportunities, but it's also difficult to imagine a stance that's less suited to challenge it. But there's another related problem to that outlook, and that is that the project of creating practical autonomy from the Russian state was perhaps too successful, in the sense that by the end of the first post-socialist decade, people were quite convinced that, in the words of one respondent, the government is on its own and people are on their own. Now, if there's such a thing as sociological truism, it's the so-called Thomas theorem, which proclaims, with due apologies for the sexist language of the time, that if men define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. And this observation, I think, is highly relevant here. It suggests that regardless of how justified people's sense of autonomy was, their firm belief that their lives are already virtually disconnected from politics, or as someone else said, the state owes me nothing and I owe nothing to the state. This sense was consequential because it allowed for the possibility of further retrenchment of state services and obligations. In the end, it's significant that practical autonomy has always been about self-protection and not resistance. And again, most studies of everyday life tend to assume that resistance is what fuels everyday life. In other words, its practices, as well as their physical manifestations, emerged as fortresses and not weapons of the weak. And as such fortresses, they were parallel in some ways to similar exclusions and partitions that were employed on a much grander scale by the newly formed Russian elites, those people who are in a far better position to implement their vision in durable architectural form. So in other words, what I'm saying is, if you have had yourself experience of privatizing public space in this spirit, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why somebody would build a condominium in place of a former public skating rink, which is the story of this condominium, and then surrounded with a 10-foot fence in the middle of the city. Now, some of these, and at the moment, the entire fabric of post-socialist cities in Russia is being reshaped by the many building projects that pursue the same logic of exclusion, privatization, and boundary maintenance at the expense of openness and publicity. And some of these may justifiably remind you of the fabric of neoliberal city plans around the world. And indeed, gated communities, partitioned neighborhoods, and controlled access roads that are popping up all around Russia today may look a lot like their counterparts in Brazil, Argentina, or China. Many might look even more exotic. I traveled to a gardening cooperative this summer, which I grew up on. And it mostly looks like this. This is basically kind of a settlement, a grid of plots with little cabins on them, cabins that are not winterized. They don't have indoor plumbing, very, very basic. And they're usually a short train ride away from the city and very vital for urban residents who usually grow flowers or berries or oftentimes potatoes and hard times on those plots. And most of these look like this. But lately, some of these plots were being bought by, I guess, people with financial opportunities who have been exploring a very different architectural idiom. Something like this. This building actually stands right across the dirt road from this one, kind of window in window. And here you have kind of a full fence, a very different architectural style, as you may see. And the very ambitious planning. There's a winter garden, a sauna, so on and so forth. Usually they would buy several plots that are adjacent to one another and then basically kind of plant grass over them. There's always a picture that you don't take. There was a balcony on the second floor which had an antique machine gun standing there kind of looking at the road, and I didn't dare to take that picture, so you'll have to take my word that it was there. But the most interesting thing actually about the settlement is that usually these gardening cooperatives are surrounded by a fence and there's one or two entrances for the cars. And so everyone who goes there kind of goes through the same entrance and then goes to whatever lane they're going to. This inventive person actually created a hole in that fence that surrounds the entire cooperative and equipped it with a radio-controlled clicker so that they have their own private entrance. Nobody else can enter. Everyone else kind of goes around and goes through the usual entrance, except for them. It's been embellished, as you can see, by the local graffiti artists. And they also paved the road just up to the point of where their own property stands, after which the pavement kind of ends, which you can see it towards the bottom. This is where there is a place where the sidewalk ends. Here it is. And then it just turns into a dirt road. And my point is, while it may look similar to a kind of a typical neoliberal development, it really has a local logic to it because it's unmistakably connected, in my view, to the post-Soviet elevation of self-protection and the tendency to equate practical competence with distance and almost autarky from the surrounding world. In other words, this transformation of space is possible, or at least palatable, to those whom it excludes, because they too have unquestioningly pursued the logic of autonomy in their daily lives. There's more than a little irony in this. As the people I spoke to would be quick to point out, it was the much detested neoliberal reforms of the 1990s that triggered the massive inflation and social dislocations that they struggled to counteract. There's nothing that they would have wanted less than to contribute to their own marginalization. Their goal was simply to retain a sense of personal competence and control in a world that was rapidly shifting all around them. But this perhaps is not the first time that people seek to protect themselves from the effects of whatever it is that beleaguered them and end up shoring up the very same thing that they oppose. So, thank you very much.